Ancient Rome, capital city of the greatest empire of all time, reaching almost to the ends of the world as it was then known. You're looking at a replica of the ancient city as it was in the days of its greatest glory. The Rome of the Caesars was a miracle of engineering and architecture. This is the Roman Forum, political and cultural heart of the empire. These magnificent buildings symbolize the power and the might that were Rome. And this is all that is left of the Roman Forum today. How did this vast empire crumble? It is a story that has fascinated mankind for 1,600 years. The story of the fall of the Roman Empire has finally been brought to the screen by producer Samuel Bronston, who was responsible for such previous productions as King of Kings, El Cid, and 55 Days at Peking. At his Madrid studio, he worked for months planning the recreation of this monumental historic drama. Philosopher-historian Dr. Will Durant, author of The Story of Civilization, moved to Madrid as a consultant on the vast project. Key members of the production were the brilliant Italian-American designing team of Veniero Colisanti and John Moore, responsible for designing both the costumes and the sets. On this empty field in the outskirts of Madrid would arise the classic buildings that were once the wonder of the ancient world. The schedule allowed 6 months to reconstruct a city that had originally taken hundreds of years to build. The task seemed impossible, but modern building techniques solved the problem. Over 250 miles of tubular steel, 200 million board feet of lumber went into the framework of the buildings that would become Rome in Madrid. With construction underway, planning continued on other production problems. The all-important woman's viewpoint was provided by Mrs. Bronston. Sketches for 10,000 costumes had to be approved before work could start on them. Another production problem was the recreation of chariots, vintage 200 AD, accurate in every detail. But perhaps the most unusual task was to gather, care for, and train the 1,500 horses that the Roman legions and their enemies would require. In a few months, Samuel Bronston owned the largest stable in Spain. Here are 1,500 hungry actors, and every one of them eats like a horse. A modern arsenal of ancient fighting weapons had to be designed, built, and maintained. Now the cast began to assemble from all over the world. Sophia Loren was the first to arrive. It was late at night and raining, but that didn't keep Sophia's fans from turning out en masse to greet her. It took a special detail of the Madrid police to get her from the plane to her hotel. The next morning, Sophia was up bright and early to report for work. Tests were the first order of business. For those of you who don't know, in a major production such as this, the cast spend days on end testing makeup and wardrobe before the picture starts. This is Sir Alec Guinness testing his wardrobe for the role of Marcus Aurelius, last of the Roman Empire's philosopher kings. The failure of Marcus Aurelius to appoint a successor led to the decline of the empire. Here is a series of tests to find the best makeup for Christopher Plummer in his role of Commodus, the dissolute son of Marcus Aurelius. Stephen Boyd plays Livius, the Roman general whom Marcus Aurelius wanted to succeed him. Here is my test of one of the costumes I wear as Timonides, the Greek slave who became advisor to a Roman emperor. This test determined how Omar Sharif would be made up for his role, the King of Armenia. Finally, it was time for production to begin. Director Anthony Mann carefully checked details of the script with Dr. Durant before filming his first sequence, a love scene between Sophia Loren and Stephen Boyd.
As strong as I thought I was. I've not learned to live without you.
There is no life for either of us apart, Lucilla.
It didn't take long for Alec Guinness and Chris Plummer to get involved in a running chess tournament. One day, Sophia Loren didn't have to work in a single shot. So what did she do? She took a busman's holiday and visited the set. Director Mann was about to direct me in a scene in the Roman Senate. I was still being made up when Sophia arrived, but she stayed to watch us begin the filming.
A 100 times we have taught those we call barbarians what it means to make war on Rome. We've burned their villages, we've crucified their leaders, we have enslaved their young. Fires go out, the dead are buried, the slaves die slowly. But the hatred that we leave behind us never dies.
Snow in the Guadarrama Mountains was the signal for the company to move to location and begin filming the winter sequences. This is sunny Spain, 10 degrees below freezing. Script called for snow, and snow is exactly what we got. More of it than Spain had seen in 50 years. But the snows in Spain fall rarely on the plain, where the reconstruction of Rome continued apace while we were still filming in the mountains. Samuel Bronston's recreation was beginning to look like its ancient counterpart. Everything on the set had to be painstakingly made by hand. From rough cobblestones to fine statuary, no effort was spared. Spring came, and the snows began to melt. This was a new stage in the filming of the fall of the Roman Empire. For the first time, all the principal actors were on location together. At the crack of dawn, director Mann starts to line up his first shot. John Ireland, who plays a barbarian chieftain, makes his way to the set. Alec Guinness and most of the cast are already there. Stephen Boyd is checking his makeup. Anthony Quayle, busy chatting with a visitor. Christopher Plummer checks his lines. Mel Ferrer, who plays a blind Roman political leader, and Omar Sharif are also on hand. This is the first scene we shot that day. All the governors, princes, and kings of the Roman Empire gather at a Roman fort to hear Emperor Marcus Aurelius urge their support for his type of Pax Romana, a true Roman peace, under which all nations will exist as equals. This huge set was built solely for this one sequence. How do you convince a beautiful woman that a photograph does her justice? You don't try. Top Hollywood action director Yakima Kanut is briefing Stephen Boyd for a hair-raising chariot duel with Christopher Plummer. And here it is. This was one of the largest battle scenes ever recorded on film. 10,000 men were involved. To capture the ebb and flow of the battle, more cameras were used simultaneously than ever before in the history of motion pictures. I've made a lot of films, but filming on this scale was something entirely new. Meanwhile, at the Bronston Studios in Madrid, Robert Lawrence began to edit the scene in which Marcus Aurelius contemplates his approaching death.
He's come for me. The silent boatman to ferry me across the shadowed river. I am not ready for you.
I've always
always been willing to bargain with my enemies. Can we not make a treaty? For your part, I ask you to wait 2 years.
1 year. I cannot do it in less than a year.
Forgive me, boatman. I did not realize you're blind and deaf. Come for me when you will. My hand shall lead us. But I tell you this, there is a great truth we have not yet divined.
This original sketch of the Roman Forum had now become a reality. Designers Colasanti and Moore and executive associate producer Michael Wyszynski inspect the Roman Forum. Now you're going to see how accurately this was recreated. These are the standing remains of the Temple of the Divine Caesar. This drawing is an artist's reconstruction of the temple, incorporating the remains. And here is the Temple of the Divine Caesar as reconstructed for the fall of the Roman Empire. This was the Temple of Saturn. And these are the ruins of the Temple of Vespasianus. After 16 centuries, ancient Rome has again come to life. Back from location, the company prepared to shoot its first scene in the Roman Forum. Every day, the Forum was converted into an outdoor beauty parlor and barber shop. Busiest man on the set was Mr. Bronston himself. A production as large as the fall of the Roman Empire poses countless problems that require immediate decisions. There's only one man who can make those decisions, the producer. Famous composer Dmitri Tiomkin from Hollywood to begin work on the musical score for the film. Now that hat could only belong to one person. I thought so, Hedda Hopper. She's just in time to watch the entry of the barbarians into Rome. Just as spectacular in its own way is the scene in which Sophia Loren, as the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, is about to be burned at the stake. Although I have been in the business for so many years, I'm still a movie fan. Why? Because motion pictures not only entertain, but sometimes they also educate. How else but in a motion picture could a scene like this be realized? How else, for instance, but in a movie, could a historic character like this one be made to come to life?
I spoke to the gods, saying, I'm not like my father. And if I'm to be crowned Caesar, I will change all he did. I offered them my life. Twice. And told them if it was not for the good of Rome that I be Caesar, then let me be killed. But you see, I'm alive. and Caesar. Now, I wish to see Rome once more the city of light, gaiety, of beauty, and strength.
A new emperor is being crowned. The glory that was Rome lives again at its most spectacular. Rome in Madrid will be a landmark, not only to the thousands of visitors who have seen the mammoth sets, but to filmgoers throughout the world who will see Samuel Bronston's Fall of the Roman Empire.
Fall of the Roman Empire came about because Anthony Mann had been walking down the street in London and seen a condensed copy of Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire in a bookshop. And he called Samuel Bronston and said, I think this is our next film. You know, El Cid was a great experience for everybody, and Bronston was eager to repeat that experience. So then began all the research and the sketches and the casting it.
The cast of Fall of the Roman Empire was as big and as expansive as the empire itself.
The Fall of the Roman Empire.
And it was, in many respects, the very prototype of the kind of cast that one would want to put together for an epic of international appeal. There were high-end, classy English stage actors like Alec Guinness, Christopher Plummer. There was matinee idols like Stephen Boyd. There was an international superstar in Sophia Loren. All up and down the line, extraordinarily well-known and acclaimed actors.
They got James Mason, they got John Ireland, who had worked with Bronston back in Hollywood. They got a really tremendous cast.
Anthony Quayle, Mel Ferrer. It was a picture in which there was a dozen actors in lead or supporting roles who frequently were in fact the stars of their own movies. It was one of the most impressive casts of the era.
After El Cid, actually what they wanted was for Charlton Heston and Sophia, believe it or not, even though they hated each other so, to play in another epic. And of course, Heston refused. Sophia said okay, and Heston refused.
Heston, as we know, was unwilling to do Fall. And as far as Bronston was concerned, that gave him terrible misgivings. However, Tony Mann was sanguine. He felt, you know, I think we can get away with this without Heston. And if you can't get Heston, well, Stephen Boyd seemed like a good choice. Stephen Boyd had been Heston's co-star in Ben-Hur, had done a magnificent job as Messala, and he said of Stephen Boyd, he fits the costumes. That's a close paraphrase. That he's tall and he has long legs and he'll look great on a horse.
Lucilla.
Livius.
Sophia Loren was someone who Bronston saw as absolutely essential to the success of Fall of the Roman Empire. And as a result, through her husband Carlo Ponti, was able to negotiate an absolutely enormous upfront salary, one of the biggest in film history. Although it was noted at the time that a terrible mistake had been made, that all of her outfits covered her décolletage, which was, you know, noteworthy.
Tony and daughter, they got on like a house on fire, and they both had a great sense of humor. I remember him saying to me in the beginning, don't get upset because I thought I'm in love with my leading lady in every film, you know. I said, okay, fine, you know. But I thought she was lovely anyway, so.
Sophia was just crazy about the English actors, their voices. Olivier, Guinness, and instead of having music on, she had records playing all the time the great English actors speaking their lines. And that's really how she learned English. But she also loved their voices, and she fell in love with Alec Guinness's voice. And she went out with him in Madrid. She was just dressed to the hilt, as only she can. She came downstairs, and it was a rainy, windy night, and she fell in a puddle. And she got really so muddy and dirty and wet in front of her building. And she said, "Just wait for me." And he stood there with the umbrella. She went upstairs, and terribly fast, she did a complete change and came down as beautiful as before in a completely new outfit. And she said, "Quick change artist, eh?"
I will not let you leave me.
Is there a choice? Soon this trickle of blood, these few bones, this net woven of nerves and arteries will be dust. No choice.
Alec Guinness did a marvelous job with Marcus Aurelius, really capturing this sort of cerebral, stoic emperor. But he wasn't happy with the script, and he wasn't happy with his character. And ironically, in retrospect, he is one of the most memorable, perhaps the most memorable single character in the film, and contributed mightily.
When I was a child, Timonides, I had a secret fear that night would come and would never end. That we would live out our lives in total darkness. It was a small fear then.
Yet my lord sees that the sun always rises, and will again.
So you say.
Also, you have to think that George Lucas must have gotten a look at Alec Guinness in Fall of the Roman Empire, because Obi-Wan Kenobi is dressed in the same, almost the same outfit that Alec Guinness is dressed in Fall of the Roman Empire.
Father, why did you deny me?
We went to the theatre and Tony saw Christopher Plummer. And he got so excited we had to go out, because he was, "That's it, that's him, that's who I want, you know, he's the man."
Christopher Plummer was, of course, glorious in the role. He had a wonderful time with the film. It's really quite remarkable to juxtapose that role as the mad Commodus, the murderous son of Marcus Aurelius. And of course, right after that, he does Captain Von Trapp for The Sound of Music. So it's a remarkable transformation, and you know, he's a great actor, and that's why he's so beloved on Broadway at the moment, for example.
I think there were about 20,000, 16 to 20,000 people total in the film, which was a lot, and they were shot in such a way that you really saw them all, that they didn't get lost. When they shot the Battle of the Four Armies, Anthony Mann said, "We have to find a plane that is corrugated, that it goes up and down, so that we can have waves of people coming over the hill, and they're not just lost to the camera." So there was tremendous effort made in making sure that you really saw all that was there, you know, getting all the horses right, getting them all dressed right. Even in the Pax Romana scene where Alec Guinness is addressing all the armies and giving him his speech about why we're going to have one Rome, et cetera, the outfits that the people are wearing from all these different armies are correct historically. No one did that in films. You know, no one bothered to make that right. And they are tremendous scenes.
One great story as far as that's concerned is that they have the triumphal entry into Rome, and the actual square of the Forum was huge, absolutely huge. And even though they had thousands of extras, they needed them to spread out in order to make the square look like it was totally filled. They had waited all day because it had been a hugely cloudy day, and finally everybody's set to go, the clouds move aside, the direction is given for there to be action, and as the centurions are riding in on their chariots, they're tossing coins out to the crowd, and all of the extras rush to the edge of the Forum, and suddenly the Forum was empty. And so then they had to stop the filming again and set everything up. And then, of course, the clouds came back and they lost a whole day. But this is just one of the sort of ironies of massive, huge productions and what can go wrong with just a cloud and some coins.
In this era of computer-generated images and all the other digital marvels that filmmakers have at their disposal, I think that it is almost impossible to fully appreciate the enormous, colossal, almost unfathomable size and ambition of the fall of the Roman Empire sets.
Colasanti and Moore, Venero, Colasanti, and John Moore, the production designers, terribly talented people. They were just magnificent. And they, of course, knew, no bounds. I mean, just build, paint, build, whatever.
John Moore and Venero Colasanti are two of the most amazing characters in film history. Partners personally in life as well as professionally. John Moore was an American from the Carolinas. Venero Colasanti was from Italy. And they both learned costume and set design in the Italian theater and designed for some of the great theater and opera companies of the world. And the motion picture industry had segregated costume designers and production designers into two separate camps. Colasanti and Moore were unique in that they actually did both. They designed the sets that the characters walked onto, and they designed the very clothes that the characters wore as well. And nowhere was this more evident than in Fall of the Roman Empire, where they set out to not merely suggest the glories that was ancient Rome, they set out to recreate it. On a plot of land in Las Matas, about 30 kilometers outside of Madrid, on a parcel of land that was a third of a mile by 750 feet in dimension, they actually recreated the glory of ancient Rome by exact replica of the Roman Forum. There was over 350 different workers that were brought in to do the construction. There was 170,000 different concrete blocks that had to be cast and put into place. They created 27 three-dimensional structures using 1.6 million feet of metal tubing, which is 320 miles if laid end to end, 33,000 gallons of paint. There was over 350 freestanding statues of all various sizes that were cast and put into place. The tallest structure, the Temple of Jupiter, rose 165 feet in the air, and it in turn sat on top of a man-made hill that rose almost 100 feet in the air.
The sets had been built in the round, which turned out to be a source of some controversy. There are those who've said it made perfect sense for the sets to be made in the round because you could film from any angle. There were others who would claim the sets were too big, that it was a waste of money and space because there were only so many angles that you were going to work from.
These were not facades. You could walk into these buildings. The Roman Senate could truly hold a Senate. You could shoot the front of the building, you could shoot the back of the building.
In fact, not only were the sets in the round, solid buildings, they had completely finished interiors, which show up in the educational films that were made for Encyclopedia Britannica in the early 1960s on the sets there, which was absolutely staggering because nobody did that.
And it was the largest movie set ever built. I think it is still the largest movie set that's ever been built.
Uniformly, everyone I've ever spoken to who has seen those sets in person has memories of being flabbergasted. They had never seen anything like this before in their lives, whether they were people in the film industry or civilians, so to speak. They had never seen anything like this before.
His sets were like cities. And in fact, they would have signs up, Bronston Avenue, Lorraine Avenue, so people could find their way around. And the smallest details in the sets, those sets are really dense. You look at the top of a column or a statue or a vase that's just, sitting on a table. They're all accurate, and they were creating all these props that looked as if they actually belonged there. And when historians saw it, they were knocked out, because who took that kind of trouble to make a movie? Samuel Bronston did.
And these sets turned into, very quickly, one of the top tourist attractions in Spain. Every foreign dignitary, every celebrity, and certainly every motion picture distributor, his visit to Spain was not complete unless they could walk the eighth wonder of the world, which was the fall of the Roman Empire sets outside of Madrid.
Although one difference is that, or really two differences from the reality, is that it's a lot cleaner looking, truth be told, than what the real central Roman city would have looked like at the time, with pigs making their way down the streets and all that sort of stuff. The other aspect is that a lot of the buildings would have had a lot of bright paint on them, which is only something that became known relatively recently, that both the Greeks and the Romans were very big on painting their marble, not keeping it this sort of pristine white.
Every holiday, I would go to Spain to see the family with my wife, and we would spend a week or so there. And we had this exquisite experience. We arrived there one time just at the end of the shooting of The Fall of the Roman Empire. And we were guided into the set. The set was absolutely, completely deserted, empty. This quarter-mile or longer space of the Roman Forum, it was like 5 or 6 stories high around us, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted. The ground were these large, like maybe 18-inch across, big bloops of cobblestone concrete. And I thought, my God, they have built the Forum. And out of nowhere, this incredible voice began to sing. We didn't even know where it came from. There must have been one workman left somewhere on a roof, stories up, doing something. And he was singing this incredible, beautiful Spanish song called La Paloma. And I stood there with my wife, and we were just transfixed at this magic. And I thought, my God, I've died and gone to heaven.
Fall of the Roman Empire shot in a dozen different locations above and beyond just the spectacular set. The immense action scenes that take place on the German frontier. That fort set was actually built in the mountains of Seville.
Our biggest concern probably in the very beginning was the weather. I remember going up to Segovia with Tony and everybody, and Tony said, oh boy, said, one thing that I would pray for, that would snow the night before we start shooting. I said, Tony, please, don't even think of such a thing. He said, well, why not? It would look so beautiful. I said, yes, it would look so beautiful, but how long will the snow last? It'll only be with us a day or so, and then we're stuck, and you'll never be able to match the shots. Oh, no, it'll be all right, it'll be all right. I said, well, let's hope it doesn't snow. But it snowed, and we started in the snow. In fact, we were filming with snow falling, real snow. And a couple of days later, we had no snow. Now we're back to dressing the set with a couple of hundred people with buckets who are going around throwing snow or granite around to make it look like snow. So that was a chore.
And I said, can't we make a film where we're sitting by the sea and in the sun, something nice? And she said, I don't make those type of films.
And the actors were dying. Alec Guinness complains about it in his book. They were really uncomfortable and really cold.
The production went on for month after month after month. Fatigue was a problem. The immense size of the cast was a problem. They turned to the Spanish government time and time again in order to get members of the Spanish army to recreate some of the battle scenes. Just about every challenge and difficulty that one could imagine for a picture of that size and magnitude, they experienced in Fall of the Roman Empire.
Two of the greatest problems in history are how to account for the rise of Rome and how to account for her fall. We may come nearer to understanding the truth if we remember that the fall of Rome, like her rise, had not one cause, but many, and was not an event, but a process spread over 300 years.
The script for Fall of the Roman Empire was sprawling and ambitious. Ben Barsman and Basilio Franchina actually set out to write a piece as complex and as rich as the subject matter warranted. That they consulted heavily with real historians of the era. In a smart publicity move, perhaps the best-known popular historian of the day, Will Durant, was hired as a special consultant on the picture. They seized upon the story of Commodus and his disastrous reign as a pivotal moment that could sort of summarize all of the ills and all of the inherent flaws of the empire that would cause it to come crashing down. The script was immense, the script was ambitious, and the script was constantly being revised even during production.
Well, it was a story that was big, and it was a challenge because it took Rome hundreds of years to fall. Gibbon's book is 6 volumes long, and I think there was a challenge there. Can we show the Roman Empire fall in 3 hours instead of 6 volumes? And they saw all the opportunity for epicness in that. You know, Ben-Hur had been a tremendous hit. El Cid had been a tremendous hit. Could you take the same team again and try to tell the story about how an entire civilization went from a peak, because Rome as a civilization lasted much longer than the United States? How could you tell a story about how they went from riches to rags, and what were the causes of that?
You will tell your provinces, Egypt, Syria, the entire eastern half of the empire, that if there is the least resistance to my orders, I will destroy them. You will also let them know they must forget the weakness of my father.
Ultimately, the greatest challenge that they faced on the film was the challenge that did not really become evident until actually the picture was finished, which is, try as they might, the cost of the movie got away from them, and it became by far the most expensive of the Bronston pictures, and translated into contemporary dollars, one of the most expensive movies ever made.
Fall of the Roman Empire cost, there's some debate over how much it cost, but probably about $26 to $28 million. It only made a fraction of that.
I remember Bronston coming to Tony and they said, "Oh, we haven't got any more money." He said, "Well, I'm keeping shooting. I'm carrying on my job, you go and do your job." And that was it. And they got the monies, obviously. Nothing stopped.
The fundamental economic concept at the core of Sam's dream was that the pictures he was making today were going to be paid for by the success of the pictures that he had just finished making, and that he can continue to sort of roll one super production into the next super production as long as the movie's performed. Because El Cid was such a huge financial success, it gave Sam and his investors a great deal of confidence that there was more where that came from. But the cost of Fall of the Roman Empire was so colossal that it quickly wiped out any of the revenues that Sam was realizing from the other movies.
Here he had all these riches, largely from El Cid, that he could pour into. He didn't take the money for himself, he poured the money into his films. But a lot of his lieutenants and his assistants were taking advantage of that. And money was vanishing in large amounts. There were rumors that people were taking suitcases to Switzerland, filled with cash.
Such horrible opportunities for corruption arose. Wyszynski said something had to be shot in Rome when it really didn't. They built a forum, which they didn't need. Ben didn't even write any scenes in the forum. They could have done without it, but Wyszynski wanted excuses for putting millions more in his own pocket.
One of the problems was the very people who might put a stop to it were the people who were doing it. They were pretty high up in the Bronston organization. So it's, money was blown down the halls like leaves in October.
To varying degrees, everybody fed at the Bronston trough. And if all of the pictures had performed as spectacularly successful as El Cid, they might still be feeding there today. But that could only last as long as the money flow lasted, and that unfortunately came to a halt sooner than Sam would have liked.
In early 1964, a debt came due that Bronston wasn't able to make a payment on. It was with a Spanish bank. Now, one of Bronston's key backers was Pierre S. Dupont III, who between the years 1959 and 1964 signed completion guarantees amounting to some $35 million in 1964 dollars. Figuring for inflation, $2005, that's about $220 million in 2005 dollars. Indeed, by one estimation, at one point it was on the order of $140 million or close to $1 billion today. And this $1 million+ debt went to DuPont, and that wasn't enough. A cascade of demands for payment came in very, very quickly, all ultimately ending up at DuPont's door. DuPont was staggered by this. He was looking at utter financial ruin. And as a result, a relationship that had been a very, very cordial one since 1957 now exploded.
Sam's benefactors had all faded, and he was forced to go to Paramount to get the final chunk of money that he needed. And I don't know what sort of arrangement was made. Of course, Paramount was going to release the picture, but how they divvied up the proceeds, I'm not aware. But that's how he managed to finish the film.
Tony loved making films, but after he'd made Rome, he said he would not make any more epics, and he didn't.
The fall of the Roman Empire opened the Cannes Festival. It was out of competition, but it was the opening night, big gala. We sensed that it wasn't going very well. I mean, afterwards, the buzz, we knew, and Ben and I didn't like it very much.
I know that there are somewhere between 15 and 40 minutes that were shot that are not in the film. Of course, the film is 3 hours long, and making it longer might have been tough at that point.
There was a scene where Commodus and the hero were sitting on a hilltop after Commodus comes into the movie in the beginning, getting drunk, drinking from Bodas, and little by little, as they were laughing and talking with each other as boyhood friends, the seriousness of the collision between them began to get articulated in the way in which they carried on that conversation and the way in which they began to argue about the difference between a dialogue and a trialogue and the power struggle between them. Commodus's evil began to show. That scene had been cut from the movie.
I also think there were scenes shot of Sophia Loren trying to arrange for the death of Commodus, and we know that because Dmitri Tiomkin wrote the music for it. So I think there were scenes for that are also gone. But those were, again, I think, taken out to make Sophia Loren's character look better.
There was a spectacular scene where Commodus realizes the general, Anthony Quayle character, is actually his real father. And he stabs the general, and the general falls backwards. His father falls backwards into this reflecting pond in the castle, and the scene changes right away. But in the version that I saw, Commodus, when he realizes suddenly what he's done, and he screams, "Father!" and it rings, and it just chilling scene, you know, where the significance of what he's done comes through this blindness, this beautiful way in which they create the insanity in the end of the movie. That scene was cut away.
The movie, coming as it did some months after President Kennedy was assassinated in the middle of the Vietnam War, was a film that people may not have resonated with them as much as Ben-Hur, which has a happy movie with dead people coming back to life. At the end of Fall of the Roman Empire, the empire ends, lots of people are dead who we cared about in the film, and Stephen Boyd walks away. He's a hero, but he says, "I don't want anything to do with you guys, you're all crooks," and he exits the film. I think today, Fall of the Roman Empire works much better than it did in those days when it was, very dark, very unhappy film. It was spectacular what you saw, but it wasn't a film you'd feel elated coming out of. The New York Times, when Bosley Crowther reviewed it in '64, he said he felt like the Roman Empire had fallen on him because there was so much, sadness. But yet today, critics who've seen it recently love the film. We're used to having unhappy endings, and we're now living with the Iraq War and all these other things where they're not so neat and tidy, and we understand the historicity of the story that was being told by Bronson. Samuel Bronson, he felt that countries were stronger when they came together, and it's a theme in all of his movies.
Valencia for Alfonso!
It's a theme in El Cid as Spain is united. It's a theme in the Roman Empire when all the countries come together. He believed in these things. In fact, before he died, Samuel Bronson gave a short talk, and he was asked who he felt the most identity with of all the characters in his films. And he said Alec Guinness playing Marcus Aurelius in Fall of the Roman Empire, because he was able to meld something bigger out of what he had through sheer force of will.
Here, within our reach, golden centuries of peace. A true Pax Romana.
The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was something that was unique, and it was something that we needed people who had these kind of epic thoughts today, because the world is at war and the world is separated. So of all the films that he made, even though Fall of the Roman Empire was not financially as successful as he would have liked, he identified himself with Marcus Aurelius, which I think is really interesting. And I think when you see it today, it's a breathtaking film, an absolutely breathtaking experience.
I think the fall of the Roman Empire remains evocative because the remains of Roman culture and civilization are so colossal. And actually they're right to be colossal. If you step back, look at the evidence, then the Roman Empire is the biggest state that Western Eurasia has ever seen. It goes all the way from Hadrian's Wall to Iraq, to the river Euphrates. There's never been anything that big in Western Eurasia.
It's interesting the extent of the Roman Empire at its height. It covered parts of 3 continents: North Africa, Western Asia, Europe. Probably 30 plus modern countries were included in what is the Roman Empire.
The city of Rome is a totally extraordinary metropolis for its time. Over 500,000 people lived there at its height, maybe close to 1 million.
The Roman Empire was between 50 and 60 million. How many of those were slaves? How many of those were citizens? Hard to say.
The total population of the Roman Empire is something that historians and archaeologists argue about very considerably. But it's fair to say, I don't think anyone would disagree, that estimates have gone up over the last 20 years. But certainly over 100 million people.
We naturally look to ancient Rome more than we look to other periods in the history of the West. Rome as a concept was at the center of what the founding fathers were trying to do in this country. Look at some of the language: the Senate, the Capitol, the veto. These are all elements that were put together in the 18th century by a group of very learned founders of our country who were trying to imitate the Roman Republic.
The longevity of the Roman Empire is truly extraordinary. There are 2 things to bear in mind about that which help explain it. The first one is the levels of comparative political and economic development surrounding it in Northern Europe and Central Europe. Basically, there's no opposition to the Roman Empire.
200 years ago, the Gauls were our fiercest enemies. Now we greet them as friends.
Once it's united the Mediterranean world, there isn't anything in its compass that can challenge it, at least not in the first centuries. The second point is that the Roman Empire evolved in a very important way in the course of its history. It starts life as a conquest state. And basically the Romans turn up with their hobnail sandals and tread all over everybody, killing anyone who gets in the way. But the dominated populations actually buy into Roman culture. And this happens over a kind of 150-year period between about the birth of Christ and 150 AD. And that happens everywhere in every province. Everyone learns Latin, builds villas, hangs around in forums wearing togas. That's what it's about. And the Roman Empire evolves from being a conquest state into being much more of a kind of commonwealth of landowning elites.
Some provinces and some areas became highly Romanized very easily. Others never did. The Jews fought several rebellions and were finally dispersed in 135. Diaspora, where Jews are found all around the Roman Empire. The Gauls, on the other hand, were very happy to become Romans, to leave behind their Celtic language and take up Latin. Not all of them, you know. There are still people in Brittany, in that far northwest corner of France, who speak a Celtic language, not unlike Welsh. And so some held out. But in general, many of the areas were happy to become Romans.
And that's the trick it manages. It disarms people and gets them to buy into its culture. And it's the way that the landowners buy into Roman culture that provides that stickiness, that adhesion, which holds the empire together for so.
No longer provinces or colonies, but Rome. Rome everywhere. A family of equal nations.
One of the interesting conversations in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is the question as to whether barbarians ought to be made Roman citizens.
You miserable, uneducated half-men. You're not at all what we fought for. And yet... Yes, we want you.
And this is an argument which had gone on in Rome for centuries and centuries and centuries. They gave Roman citizenship out either selectively to particularly useful people, or to a city or a town or even a province, to a degree that they not only were citizens, they not only were senators, but they even became emperors.
There's never been anything that big in Western Eurasia. It's also the longest lived state that there's ever been. Most of this held together as one political entity for the best part of 500 years. Makes anything like the Soviet Empire or even the British Empire look like a bit of a joke, frankly. So to have something that big and that long-lasting, finishing, that's what's really interesting. Why should something that was that big have come apart?
The fall of the Roman Empire has been an intriguing intellectual issue for thousands of years, if you will. During the 2nd century CE, there were 5 emperors who we call the good emperors, ruling from 96 to 180. And the last of those emperors was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who spent the last 17 years of his life on the frontiers up along the Danube fighting against the Germans. At his death, something dramatically changed. There are no more good emperors.
Rome has changed since you were there.
It is now Commodus, and after Commodus, we begin with a series of emperors who have fought their way to the throne at the head of armies. And for the next 3 centuries, Rome does survive in some form, but it is also a very conflicted state. That period of the happiest age, the 2nd century, is over.
Rome has changed. It's now crawling with gladiators.
Because the empire is so large, and because by the late Roman period there is a rival superpower, Persia, in the east, that tends to mean that you need to have an emperor in the east. And if you have an emperor in the east, he's too far away to run the west, so you tend to have an emperor in the west as well. And where you have 2 imperial courts, then there are very often rivalries and at least differences of emphasis in terms of which type of policy is most important. You know, the emperor in the east is not going to think that the Rhine frontier defending the west is the most important area, and so on. So there's that kind of problem.
I say no! We are Romans, warriors. Let us rid our minds of this poisonous idea.
When the empire ended, you've got to think about what it is that's actually ending. The most useful distinction to me, it seems, is to make a distinction between the actual central Roman state, which does things, that raises taxes, that employs an army using that taxation revenue, that builds things, that runs governmental structures, and so forth, and then provincial Romans living Roman-style lives. What happens in the 5th century, first and foremost, is the destruction of the capacity of the West Roman state to maintain itself. Basically, it loses control of its taxation revenue, it therefore can't employ any more soldiers, and it loses power in a very straightforward way. But in that process, there are many islands of Roman provincial life left behind, so Romanness doesn't disappear overnight.
The political fall of the Roman Empire is not as important as certain kinds of continuities that continue. Christianity is there before and after the fall in 476. Latin as a language is there before and after the fall. Many elements in society, family structures, are there before and after the fall. And so the scholars have been wrestling with the question of whether this date means anything, or whether, again, as the movie suggests at the beginning, it is simply part of a very long process.
I've now come to understand the Roman Empire in many ways as the mother of all one-party states. So you're really looking at something that's equivalent to great Soviet monoliths or Ceausescu's Palace of the People, but nonetheless a lovely squared-off bit of Roman sandstone neatly put in place in some fabulous palace or temple column or an aqueduct, whatever. Still sets my heart racing. I'm afraid I'm a nerd and there's no way past it.
Hollywood films are meant to entertain on one hand and to portray art.
Greetings, Kostobicus.
It's not the role of Hollywood, to serve as a history lesson.
It's good theatre. That's what you should judge these things on. It's not a documentary. It's not meant to be a documentary.
I think it's very interesting in historical fiction or in films based on historical facts how one weaves together the fictional characters and the real characters.
The fall of the Roman Empire, certainly in its physical attributes, the Forum Romanum was a stunning recreation, although one difference is that it's a lot cleaner looking than what the real, central Roman city would have looked like at the time, with, pigs making their way down the streets and, filthy people and all that sort of stuff, although there were lots of clean people as well. And there were the Roman baths, we can't forget that, which helped keep folks relatively clean. So the fact that it was pristine, that's only something that really starts to show up now and on HBO and the like.
The sets are truly extraordinary. None of this is done up by technicians in the back. This is all built, and they are huge, and they're pretty realistic, I think.
In terms of the historical accuracy of the story, well, in some ways it's accurate, in some ways it's not accurate. Will Durant was the then already elderly author of a multi-volume popular history series called The Story of Civilization, which was a bestseller. And he was brought on to the Braunston team, so to speak, in order to lend his imprimatur as one of the best-known historians in the United States.
Ben and Basilio, who were writing the screenplay, did not use the work of Will Durant. Will Durant may have done quite a bit of research on the fall, but actually they would consult with the Spanish historian to see if what they wanted to do was at all compatible with history. That's how it went.
In the fall of the Roman Empire, the two chief historical characters are Marcus Aurelius and his a little bit unstable son, Commodus.
But these wars have been endless.
Endless because you were too gentle. I would have fought these wars differently.
There's a lot we do differently, Commodus.
I found that Marcus Aurelius was a little bit too saintly, and it made Alec Guinness seem a little ponderous, a little pompous. I would have liked the good guys to be as interesting as the bad guys, because the bad guys, as so often is the case with historical movies, seem a lot more interesting than the good guys, and they performance by Christopher Plummer as Commodus, I think, is the most intriguing performance in the film.
I loved you, Livius. Yet now you must die. But that's the sort of joke the gods love best.
There's a core to the film that is based on real events in the sense that it does look as though Commodus did actually go a bit bonkers later in life. But he was only 19 when he inherited the throne. And I think you can see why someone who was basically a teenager inheriting supreme power over the greatest state the Western world has ever seen might actually go a bit bonkers. And that element doesn't come out in the film because Christopher Plummer is obviously a mature adult. It's also real that Commodus had a sister who plotted against him. So the Sophia Loren character existed. Doubt she was as good looking, frankly, but there you go.
Well, she was the love interest in Barsman's script, so they didn't really want to have her be involved in a plot to kill her brother because it just would have been unseemly for Sophia Loren.
She was executed because the plot that she was involved in was uncovered only 2 years after Commodus took over power, and she is got out of the way very quickly, so she doesn't outlive him as she does in the film.
And so, Caesar must give his daughter in marriage to the king of Armenia.
I had hoped the gods would be kind.
As far as I know, the notion that she was going to be married off to the king of the Armenians is a historical fabrication. Then, of course, there are other characters, most notably Livius, the hero, if you will, who is a fictionalized character.
There's no good evidence that Marcus Aurelius was trying to disinherit Commodus, as is one of the film's themes.
The notion that Marcus Aurelius would have liked to pass the empire on to someone who was more competent than his worthless son is a very romantic one. And we want to believe that a man who had been so concerned about power that he would not have given the empire to such a worthless kid as his son. And so out of that comes the desire for alternatives.
Gaius Livius, warrior, voyager, Commodus, most Roman of them all.
And the alternative in this case is Livius.
The men we send first into battle will be used as bait. Many will die. It will be especially dangerous for their leader.
One of my problems in looking at fictionalized versions of ancient Rome is the natural emphasis on conflict, on war. All of that is there. There's no question about it. But the Romans did not build a civilization that lasted for 1,000 years only on conflict. They built a lot of it on hard work. And so I like always to see in a movie some indication of this world of reality that we need to understand and appreciate the Romans for. And this movie has several of those moments. For example, Commodus simply says we're going to raise the taxes on all the kingdoms from the east.
We will have games. The people of the city will be fed. You and your eastern provinces will send us twice the grain they have been sending. The taxes on them will be doubled.
Because he wants to have bigger celebrations. Hey, it costs a lot of money to bring ostriches from Africa. We know that these ships were filled with animals, bringing them across, and thousands would be killed in one day at the Colosseum. There are some wonderful mosaics in Sicily that show these animals being loaded onto boats and loaded off of boats. And so Commodus is saying, you guys out in the provinces are going to have to pay more money so that we can have fun in Rome. And this is not fiction.
I wish to see Rome once more the city of light, gaiety, of beauty, and strength.
My impression of the fall of the Roman Empire is that the outdoor scenes are quite wonderful. The scenes in the snow, the scenes of battle, the scenes of gladiators, the final scene between Livius and Commodus.
I was also staggered by the amount of Roman armor that the costume people had put together for these great parades and all the rest of it. The initial impression the film makes on me is expense and determination, I think, to be accurate in the way the thing looks, or as accurate as it's possible to be. I mean, there's an awful lot we don't know about the way Romans lived and dressed, and there always is that slight tendency in Hollywood films for Roman men always to be in armor, basically because we don't know what they did when they took their armor off. And of course, they didn't normally wear their armor any more than you'd wear your overcoat.
In some ways, it's accurate. In some ways, it's not accurate. For example, Commodus was strangled in his bed. He did not die in the arena. Gladiator did the same thing. Had him dying in the arena. But I want to stress something as a professional historian, as an academic, and that's not the role of films. They will take reality and bend it to its purposes in the same way that a painter would do that, and I've never had any problem with that. It certainly can serve to inspire folks in the general public and academics as well to look more deeply into a subject. It can provide some kind of window into the past, but I never have a problem with the idea of a film not being some perfect history lesson, because frankly it would be boring as hell if it were.
Fair to say that Dmitri Tiomkin worked in every genre in Hollywood. He was good with period films, he was good with comedies, he was good with dramas, with westerns. He dabbled in every genre. Certainly the sort of big epic films that Samuel Bronston produced in the 1960s were as grand scale as his career ever got.
He thought big, Bronston, which Dmitri enjoyed, and he had a lot of colourful characters around. I think there was also a lot of anxiety amongst some of the people who were working with him, just in case they would run out of money for making the picture and paying the people who were working on it.
Bronson had been working with Miklos Rozsa, who had done El Cid, but Rozsa didn't want to work with Bronson anymore because he felt there were too many sound effects in El Cid that were covering up his music, and a lot of music he wrote was taken out, and you were left with clanking swords and everything. So Rozsa had a healthy ego, and he didn't like the fact that every note wasn't in the film, so they hired Dmitri Tiomkin.
Bronston and Tiomkin must have met sometime in 1961 or 62, in the aftermath of El Cid, which Miklos Rozsa had scored. Tiomkin was signed to do 55 Days at Peking, and they obviously hit it off, because at the end of 1962, there's a trade announcement that a deal had already been done to do Fall of the Roman Empire, which wasn't even due to begin shooting. In fact, there are full-page trade ads in February of '63 indicating that Bronson was announcing his musical association with Dmitri Tiomkin. He obviously respected Tiomkin's musical abilities and probably his collaborative abilities as well. I think one of the reasons that Bronston and Tiomkin worked so well together and continued to collaborate, I mean, not just on Fall of the Roman Empire, but on 55 Days at Peking and Circus World, was that Tiomkin felt comfortable that Bronston would, in fact, spend the money needed to do each score correctly. If you look through the clippings from Tiomkin's career from 1963 and 1964, you can see that he spent most of 1963 on this film, in an era when most film composers would maybe spend 6 or 8 weeks total conceiving, writing, and recording a score. Here, you've got a composer who spent much of a year on this, not just conceiving ideas and actually being present at the shooting and conferring with Bronston, but by the time he gets to late 1963, when he actually starts to write the score, that actually takes most of the fall and into the early part of the winter. A lot of it was written here in Hollywood with the assistance of 3 orchestrators, but a good deal of recording went on in London in late 1963, then he came back here, and then he went back in London in early 1964 to record some more, and I think that Bronston must have spent a fortune on the music alone, because Tiomkin felt that things needed to be done just right, and Bronston clearly gave him the freedom to do that.
I think he very much enjoyed working at that time on those pictures. He was able to have such a variety of instruments in his picture and use such large orchestras. It was just a huge scope for him, which he loved.
He made quite a number of visits to confer with Bronston about the music. There were even ideas along the way that perhaps he would contribute songs that might be sung on camera by some of the players. That clearly did not come to fruition. But the fact that he was around and they were talking about this, again, gives me an indication that he probably soaked up the atmosphere, he probably looked at the sets, he probably thought while he was looking at these grand scale scenarios with thousands of extras in them. I'm sure that was an influence in terms of what he ultimately would write.
The part that is still inexplicable is the fact that he does not use the Wagnerian techniques of leitmotifs in the picture, and you expect it.
Skostobicus, King of the Omnia.
Robin Hood has a theme. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, the Force, the dark side, they have their own themes.
I think by the early 1960s, that notion, which sort of started in the late 1930s, with, especially at Warner Brothers with the music of Erich Wolfgang Korngold, was sort of thought of as somewhat passé. You didn't need themes for every character. So I think Tiomkin's approach was themes for situations and for relationships rather than individual characters.
That is confusing because it is unique. No composer who wrote symphonic scores ever did that, ever eschewed the idea of this is her theme, this is his, this is the fall of the Roman Empire theme, this is what, and so that doesn't happen. That forces people to have to hear the music in a different way.
Tiomkin said that, and properly so, that we know next to nothing about the music of ancient Rome, what they would have listened to. There are good guesses about what they might have listened to, and the sort of traditional notion that they probably had plucked instruments such as lyres, and they probably had flutes, and there was probably a good deal of chanting going on. That's the basics that I think most people assume. And I think because so little was known, I think Tiomkin felt free to create dramatic music that worked for the picture and maybe gave us some sense of antiquity along the way.
Instead of trying to do what Roja did, which was to write music that would have been similar to Roman music, and Roja did a great job of that in Quo Vadis and in Ben-Hur, Tiomkin wrote more modern music with modern chords, and there's a big organ at the beginning, because he wanted to write music that captured the sweep of the epic, but wasn't necessarily had historical sounds to it.
Right from the opening fanfares of Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a terrific and very short piece where there's antiphonal brass. You hear out of the left, you hear it out of the right. And probably there was back of the theater, front of the theater, there was probably quadraphonic music going on. Some of those fanfares, the brass play with flutter tongue. You hear this really guttural sound, and it's really ugly and really forceful, and it kind of gives you this gigantic impression of the kind of suffocating nature of the Roman Empire. Tiomkin uses it in other scores. He uses it in Dial M for Murder, he uses it in the Hitchcock films, and it has a very visceral impact. I know of no other composer of the great early film composers who ever made use of this sound.
I think the main title sequence is really interesting. You're listening to a giant cathedral organ playing something that one might sort of think of as a kind of Bach prelude before the orchestra comes in to play the main theme.
You think back on film scoring, when was a pipe organ ever used? Well, once that you can think of, which was a few years before in El Cid. The big moment when El Cid appears on the horse and Miklos Rozsa brought out the pipe organ, something he hadn't used for the entire score. Now this picture starts and it kind of links up with that, bang, organ. And you say, well, were there pipe organs in ancient Rome? Well, first of all, no one will care about that in reality, but the answer to that question, by the way, is yes.
I think the whole idea of organ and a kind of prelude a la a Bach piece was his way of saying this is a classic in its own way. And if you listen to the very end of his score, the final notes of the movie, it too, with a little two-note phrase, suggests classical music. And I think he kind of bookended it that way, and I think he intended to do so.
The organ was recorded in the Westminster Hall in Parliament Square, which I think he absolutely loved. And some of the musicians from the Royal Military School were included with the brass, and there was such a variety of different musicians and instruments.
It's a rather complex score. There's more than 2 hours of music in the movie, and in fact he wrote about 2.5, for some of which didn't make the final cut. So it's a huge amount of music for this 3-hour picture. So naturally there have to be multiple themes. The main theme, which we're introduced to over the main title, which is not only the theme for Fall of the Roman Empire, but which he called Fall of Love, serves two purposes. One is, it's obviously the main theme of the picture and recurs, especially at the end of the movie, for the fall of Rome. But it also doubles as the love theme for Stephen Boyd and Sophia Loren. And it's in that context that we hear it most often, in a much more gentle form, a more romantic form.
Have you finished with Commodus and wine?
My world has suddenly become strange. I'm not sure where I am. I'm sure of only one thing.
I like that theme a lot. I think it's a classic, frankly, because it's so perfect for the movie. It not only provides us with this sort of grand and grandiose kind of setting for the great Roman Empire, but there's also something melancholy about it. There's also something that suggests that there's a finality to all this, that things are going to come crashing down, both in terms of the relationship of Boyd and Loren, but also in the empire itself.
Welcome.
Pericles, proconsul of Athens.
Pericles of Athens.
There's the Pax Romana theme, which is a grand march that we first hear when Marcus Aurelius is reviewing that parade of soldiers. And of course that recurs in the film. There's a friendship theme that we first hear for Stephen Boyd and Christopher Plummer when the two of them go out and meet each other on the road in their chariots together.
Gaius Livius, warrior, Boyd!
There's a theme for Marcus Aurelius's funeral. It's a dirge, a kind of funeral march in a way. And Tiomkin called it profundo, meaning deep, profound. That in turn also recurs in the film. There is savage, angular, highly percussive music for the barbarian attack in Germania. And those, I think, are the main themes.
And I think, like El Cid, The Fall of the Roman Empire shows when the director wanted no music and when he wanted it to come in. And when there's wind, when there is sound effects. You know, one of the great moments in The Fall of the Roman Empire is when the men of the Roman army start to go, ooh. This keening sound at the site of the dead Caesar. I don't know whether this was the screenplay, whether it was Mr. Mann's idea, or whether it was Tiomkin's idea, but it is extraordinary.
There's a wonderful musical moment right after James Mason dies and Stephen Boyd finds his body.
What happened, gentle Greek? Did you try to tell them there were 3 possibilities? Did you not know there was a 4th possibility? Yes!
This is the way they answer reason. And now even you must see that this is the only way to answer them.
Look at his face. Tell me what I must do in his name. March the army into Rome and drench the city with blood!
He's dead.
That's just a wonderful elegy for the dead, peace-loving Greek.
I loved you, Livius.
There's a scene where Christopher Plummer talks about listening carefully and you can hear the gods laugh. Well, if you listen carefully, you can hear Tiomkin in his score respond to that note as if the gods were laughing in his music. It's a wonderful moment.
You told me once you'd never heard the gods laughing. Listen. Listen carefully.
There's music for the Roman Forum. There's a wonderful, colorful piece for the attack of the Persian army. And perhaps most notably in the end of the film, the Tarantella for the celebrating Romans at the end when the empire is falling apart. The Tarantella is a kind of Italian dance. Although not really invented until the Middle Ages, I think that Tiomkin felt that there was something about that particular colorful, bright, vivacious piece of music that fit that scene, and partway through it, he interpolates the Fall of Rome theme in the middle of it. It's really a marvelous dramatic moment. These are just a few of the kind of things that Tiomkin did that I think enhance the film.
I do not claim to understand the choices that Tiomkin made, which makes him so fascinating. I can usually tell you why Korngold chose to do this in The Adventures of Robin Hood or Between Two Worlds. I can really crawl into the mind of a Miklos Rozsa and think I at least understand. But in the case of this score, there are times when the music is in the major. When the Roman army is going into the woods, baiting the barbarians, the music has no tension in it at all. In other words, it's like what you'd call on the piano the white notes. There wouldn't be harmonic density. Sometimes when we see just before the poisoning of Caesar, the apple, again, it's a major chord. It's not what the Germans would call a Shrek chord. It's not uh-oh music. But that might be mistaken because my expectations are for it to be Germanic and actually describe an event as opposed to setting a mood.
It's interesting that Fall of the Roman Empire didn't really need a song. But Tiomkin wrote a great tune for the main theme and then brought in Ned Washington to write lyrics for it, and that's how it became the song Fall of Love. After the lyrics had been written, Tiomkin had them translated into Italian, and that's what you're hearing over the intermission music. In fact, it was recorded in Italy with the St. Cecilia Choir and a harpsichord. I mean, it's a wonderful touch. So you never really hear the English lyrics of that song anywhere in the picture. Fall of the Roman Empire was nominated for Best Original Score at the Oscars in 1964. It lost, unfortunately, to Mary Poppins, but there was no beating Mary Poppins in 1964. That was bound to happen. Interestingly enough, though, he did win the Golden Globe for original score for Fall of the Roman Empire, and the same year won the Globe for Best Song for the tune from Circus World, another Bronston production.
Was he one of the greats? Surely. But the controversial nature of Tiomkin, I think, is bound up in our expectations of the music being of the Austro-Germanic style, and in point of fact, It is almost prehistoric in its Russian nature, and that is counterpointed against his ability to write a really good tune.
There's a grand scale to the music of Fall of the Roman Empire. It's not only big in terms of the size of the orchestra he used, there's a kind of grand feeling to this music, as well as a feeling that there is something wrong here, that there's something sad and ultimately destructive. This is something that I think Tiomkin was able to convey in his music, which makes it so right, I think, for this film. I think of Fall of the Roman Empire as one of Tiomkin's last great works. There are complaints from time to time, I think, especially from contemporary audiences, saying that sometimes Tiomkin's music is a little too busy, or that perhaps he's made too strong a hit to open up a scene, and perhaps those criticisms are valid. But I think if you take a look at the entire work, the score as a whole, not only does it serve the picture, I think, really beautifully, it works on its own as a musical experience apart from the film. That soundtrack album, which interestingly enough hit Billboard's top 200 in 1964, meaning people were out there buying the music as well, I think it works on its own as a musical experience as well as any of Tiomkin's scores. And it's, I think, a classic in its genre.